Geoff Palmer was a pioneer, is how I described him on his death, and he has contributed enormously to making Scotland the country that it is today. We need more kindness and we need more wisdom in our society, and Sir Geoff Palmer embodied it.
A few years ago, I had the absolute privilege of spending some time with Sir Geoff Palmer on this podcast. That conversation will turn out to be one of the most impactful I've ever had. People will send me messages, some would even call, telling me how much it meant. Colleagues will stop me at work to discuss the episode. Just a couple of weeks ago, I received the heartbreaking news that Sir Geoff had passed. Today, I want to revisit that conversation, not just as a tribute, but as a way of keeping his voice, his wisdom, and his story alive. What you're about to hear is the voice of a man whose words and life challenges us. So, let's go to the episode.
I arrived in this country in 1955, and I came because my mother was here. And she came in 1951, and she's a member of the Windrush generation. Because of that, I think the Windrush generation covers 1948 to 1971. So she's a member of that, and I am as well, because I came in 1955. And I traveled here on my own in 1955. And I had to go back to school because it came as a great surprise to my mother that she brought me here to work in 1955. And of course, when I arrived in March 1955, she took me home to London, in London where she lived. And of course, the next day, I just traveled 5,000 miles, and a lady who I had not seen from 51 to 55, who I didn't recognize at Paddington when I arrived, decided I was going to work. And of course, she was stopped by a man at the door who was checking on children then when they arrived. And he told her I wasn't 15. I had to go back to school for 1 month because I was 14 years and 11 months. And my mother went quite, she was not happy. That she said she spent £86, she told him, to bring me here. And she needed my money to help pay the rent. And he just said he's got to go to school. He's not 15. Now, the two people, there are lots of people who have involved in my life for me to be here today talking to you. But I will just pick out two because one was, if I do it in order, it was the headmaster who took me, because one rejected me and said I was educationally subnormal. That means I was ineducable in 1955, and rejected me from that school. And the other school, Shelburne, it was called Shelburne Road Secondary Modern, in the middle of London, in Highbury. It was in North London. He took me, and he said, I will not take you for a month. I'm going to take you for a term. And had he not said a term, because the term was the summer term, because March was Easter, and it was 1 month. Thus, the summer term would then be summer, and I played cricket. And it's because I played cricket why I'm talking to you today, because that got me transferred to the grammar school, because I was very good at cricket. And that got me transferred to a grammar school and then furthered my education. So Mr. Bullen, I think his name was, who took me into that school but did not take me for 1 month. He took me for a term. Had he not taken me for the term, I wouldn't be speaking to you today. And the other person, and I'll bring Scotland in here because this happened in London, was Professor Anna MacLeod, who worked at the Heriot-Watt University. And when I got a degree at Leicester University in 1964, so 55 to 64. I couldn't get a job in London, even though I had an honours degree in botany from Leicester University. And I got a job. The only job I got was peeling potatoes in a restaurant. And in fact, not far from my school, the old school which I went to, Shelburne Road. So I went to that school, got to university, came back, and I was working next door to the school in a restaurant peeling potatoes, which I could have done without a degree.
Yep.
But nevertheless, I had a degree. I was peeling potatoes, and there's 2 jobs were advertised. I saw them in the newspaper, and I applied for one. And that was the famous interview I had with probably the second most powerful politician in the country. And there is a recording of this incident. I think the BBC has a program called Life Scientific, and it's recorded in there. I think it was about 2015. I'm not sure of the date, where I refer to what I'm going to say now. And this politician interviewed me, and he told me I should go back to where I come from and grow bananas.
Whoa.
And I, again, because I say I'm not emotional, so it didn't really bother me much, I responded. And I said to him that it's difficult to grow bananas in Haringey. And what I was pointing out was my sense of belonging. And this is the history of Black people, that I was telling him that when I was in Jamaica, this country was called the mother country. And to me, this is the mother country of my slavery, and therefore, and my colonialism. And now that I'm here, nobody can tell me to leave. And therefore, telling him that about growing bananas, what I was really saying, I'm going nowhere to grow bananas. And if they don't grow here, it's too bad. And of course, I didn't get the position, but I felt better. So the other interview was, again, now why I'm here, because I was interviewed by Professor Anna MacLeod at the Heriot Watt. And it was called a college then. It was Heriot Watt College. And the interview was at Chambers Street in the middle of Edinburgh, because Heriot Watt has a now big campus, has a big campus at Riccarton. And the campus wasn't there then, so I had to go to Chambers Street for this interview, and she interviewed me. And, you know, it was really interesting, because the interview was one of where she said, why do you want to do a PhD on barley? And I said, I had no idea, but there were no other jobs, and I don't want to peel potatoes for the rest of my life. This is how I put it. And because I'd done no research other than the research I did for my honours degree, and we didn't do barley, or cereals as such, because they weren't regarded as scientifically important. They were man-made, you know, because they were agricultural products as such. So anyway, I said I didn't know anything about barley, and she said, do you know anything about brewing and distilling? I said, no. And she then said, I'm going to take you anyway. And I said, why? And she said, when I was telling you about that you were looking out the window. And she said, I don't like keen people. And you don't show that keenness. Which she said I like, because you're somebody who will not say something that is not true. And she said, I like that. And I said, fine. And that's how I was selected to do the PhD. But what I checked afterwards, we got to know each other very well from 1964 December until she passed away, you know, probably 2000s. She actually said what she had done was to check my background. And she said the degree I got from Leicester University plus my background made me more than qualified for the position. So she was adding the degrees of difficulties
Mm.
that she detected, which other people did not have. And therefore, what we then discussed was wider access. How can we get people from different communities, not just people from the colonies, but British people living here, born here, who are of different, what we used to call classes, from different communities, different ethnicities. How can we get a decent representation in our institution? And therefore, she took me as part of that concept of wider access. So Professor Anna MacLeod, there's a hall of residence named after her in the Heriot Ward.
Wow.
And also Mr. Bullen, who, it's interesting because I've spoken about him before in the media. And somebody contacted me and said they were a relative of Mr. Bullen. And they were so moved by the fact that they didn't know he'd done that to me, because he probably wasn't a big thing for him at the time in 1955. But they were so pleased that I am thanking a relative for something which they didn't know he did. So those two people, without them, I would not be speaking to you today.
Wow, that is very profound. It's a very deep way to start this episode. You've gone on from those, experiences and moments, become a professor emeritus, won awards, spoken at various, places all over the world.
Mhm.
When you look back on your journey, particularly your upbringing and childhood, what sort of values were imbibed in you from that age, and what were those experiences like for you?
Well, if my background is, I will use my background to answer the question.
Yes, sir.
That I was born in Jamaica in 1940, and my father was what was called a shoemaker, and I'm told he was a very good one. And my mom came from nearby, so they came from parishes. One was St. Elizabeth, and one was Manchester. Believe it or not, Manchester. And Manchester is named after a governor of Jamaica.
Wow.
Manchester, yes, Lord Manchester, and the capital of Manchester is Mandeville, and that's named after his son, Lord Mandeville. So within Jamaica, we can pick up names. And in Manchester, there is a Balcarras, and there's a Balcarras Street in Morningside. So where I come from in Jamaica, we have links with Scotland and the UK, even through names. There is a Glasgow in Manchester.
Wow.
In Jamaica. And there is a Glasgow in Manchester. In fact, one of my relatives lives in Glasgow in Manchester. And when she writes to me, it sounds very much like the weather in Glasgow. So somebody from Glasgow must have gone to Manchester and thought, this looks like Glasgow. Called it Glasgow. So that's where I come from. My mom came from Manchester. My dad came from St. Elizabeth, which is next door. And I was born in a place called Monroe College District. And of course, the Scottish Monroes, the hills. So again, that's where I was born. So I had that link, but didn't know the history. So my mom and my dad took me to Kingston. That's the capital. And everything went okay until a lot of Jamaican men, and this is a product of our history, that men who were not doing very well because of the work they were doing, because it was very, it was very periodic in terms of it was going well and then it's not going well. And a lot of the Caribbean men, and especially in Jamaica, took off and went to America to work in what they call farm working. and I never saw him again until 1975, from 47 to 75. And I saw him when I went to give a lecture, a scientific lecture, an international conference. I was speaking, and I looked at the back door, and the door opened. And there were three black guys standing at the door, and everybody in the hall was white except me. I was in New York in 1975. And the three guys walked up to the front, sat down, and to cut a long story short, when I finished lecturing, I went outside. The three of them came out, and I spoke to them. And the one in the middle said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "Of course I do." And he said, "Who am I?" And I said, "You're my father."
Wow.
And that was my first meeting with my father between 1947 and 1975. And he turned up because I think my mother knew I was going to lecture in New York, and she told somebody who told him. So that reestablished that kind of link. And that is a link which probably was not unique to me in terms of men leaving the Caribbean to go to better themselves, so to speak, and the family breaks up in that regard. So that was my early life. And when my mom left Jamaica in 1951, because that's 47 to 51, she left, and I saw her leaving in 51 on the docks. But some people say, "Didn't that upset you? Your mom was going to England." I said, "No, because she was going to work to get money to feed me. And she left me with her sisters," which was quite common, that you find that mothers with their sisters were very close because the sisters sometimes looked after their children.
Right.
So that link, with family link in the Caribbean, was very important because mothers and their sisters were very close in terms of interdependence, in terms of the help, one helping the other. So my mom left me with her sisters. And by then I had a small brother. So she left me and my brother to be looked after by her sisters. And there were like 7 or 8 of them. I can't remember. There's so many of them that they were disciplinarians. You know, when there was one word, I was saying it last night to the lady who was launching her book in Edinburgh. And she was saying things. I said, "What you're saying is that in Jamaica, the one word or 2 words, behave yourself." When you're leaving the house, that's the last thing my aunts would say to me: behave yourself. And if they heard you did not behave yourself, you're in trouble, whether it's going to church or school. And therefore, the great influence on me, my aunts, those women who I would say fathered me, that, and this is not uncommon. It's a part of our history in Jamaica, that you take somebody like Bob Marley's father was there and his father left. There are other people in Jamaica exactly the same as myself, but the women were given this responsibility and they looked after the children. And therefore, you know, we owe a lot in our history and in our culture to the women. And the phrase, "the woman who fathered me," is not uncommon in our culture. And thus, these aunts, you know, when I look back at them, you know, I've got photographs of them and people have published, you know, things of my aunts. I think there's a little book on the table, which I'll show you, where the Scottish Parliament asked me to write a thing because it was the 500th anniversary of their magazine, and I wrote an article, and there's a copy of their magazine on there, and I gave them a picture of 2 of my aunts and my uncle and my grandaunt, and they are part of the auntie gang that looked after me, and they made sure that I went to school. And as I said earlier, they made sure I went to church 3 times every Sunday. And I've got a little New Testament Bible somewhere over there, which I got in God, I can't remember the date, but I've got a little Bible on there, and I got it for regular attendance at Sunday school. That was my first award, my first thing, my first qualification award is for attending Sunday school. Attending Sunday school, because I never missed one. The only way I could miss a Sunday school or a church on a Sunday, I had to be sick. And that meant taking castor oil.
Oh,
Because
okay.
their attitude was if you were sick, you had to take castor oil. So I would rather go to church than take castor oil. And believe it or not, that is the influence which has fashioned my attitude. The fact is, if I've got to do something, I've got to be extremely ill not to do it.
Wow.
And I don't make excuses. If I can do it, I will, because my aunts gave me that discipline, that once you're committed and something has to be done, it has to be done. And if you don't do it, and I tell that with the history, I tell today that our history is not about the past, because you can't change the past. You can't change what has happened. Not 1 inch of it you can. But the past has consequences. And that's what I was taught. When you did anything, it has a consequence. And therefore, either you've got to deal with it or somebody else has to deal with it. And what the consequences of our past is racism. It's the way women are treated. It's the way we treat animals. It's the way we treat the old. All those are of past misjudgment, past prejudices, past wrongs. And we now, I think, should deal with that. And my aunts, they've instilled that into me, that when you do something, think of the consequences. And when I say that today, you get highfalutin, high-level academics who've never thought of consequences. Because they're thinking, oh, you can go back to the past and you can explain it. Slavery was because we needed the money economically, and black people were inferior to white people, so we could enslave them. And I said, well, where's the evidence for the inferiority? Nobody can tell me. And when people say you're different races, and I say to audiences, I said, I want this audience, high, low academics, they call themselves. I say, I want you to define race. You got 5 minutes. I'm going to stop lecturing. You tell me what race is. Nobody's done it yet. And therefore, those women with no education themselves, because they left school at 11, like my mum, 11 years of age, they understood that what you did in life has consequences. And therefore, to me, they have instilled in me that sort of principle of life, which I apply. And I didn't get it from academia. And therefore, to me, they are one of the greatest people with any sort of influence. Other people with influence, nothing as important as that.
Absolutely.
The other people are maybe scientists who worked in my field and, who did things. But in terms of the impact on the way I live, I would say that my aunts, they cover just about every aspect.
Wow. That's an amazing story, and it's interesting, in my opinion, very inspiring to note the influences or the incredible power our guardians or parents or aunts have on us. To think at that young age you were shaped with these values that have become a consistent, steady force through your life.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about activism and racial inequality. Just before we started this podcast, we were talking about Henry Dundas and some of the work done there. What inspired you to get more involved in the conversation around racial inequalities, standing up for the people who are not represented enough in society?
Okay. Well, what did that for me is when I arrived in, at Liverpool. That's where my boat arrived. In fact, my trip, again, this is part of it, because when my mom sent for me, this is a term we use, you're sent for. And I woke up one morning and my aunts just said to me, your mother has sent for you. That's 1955. I don't know whether they said it with relief, but they got the fares and they got the tickets and they got everything. And what was interesting, which I never thought of, and as I say, I'll let you see the copy of my grandaunt, because she was a very tall woman, and she was my aunt's aunt, and it was her house in Kingston we lived in.
Wow.
So all of us, my aunts, myself, my mom then when my father left, and my brother, we all lived in that one house in Kingston. And it's only dawned on me sort of recently thinking about all that. My grandaunt, she was a very tall, elegant lady, wear long dresses and boots with the zip up the side, which is now fashionable.
Yep.
But she wore that. And she always had a hat on and a Bible under her arm. And it was her house. And I thought, no, who the devil was she? But she was fairer in complexion than we were. So I have no idea where she originated from, but she was my mother's aunt. Now, when I arrived in Britain, there was colorism in Jamaica because a lot of Jamaicans are light in complexion. And because of slave owners had slaves with their children, with their slaves, slave owners had children with their slaves. Okay. So the slave owners having children with their slaves, we have a lot of mixed race, as you may call it, people. And they were called mulatto at the time. And the whole idea then of when I came to Britain and saw just white people, the only white person I know in Jamaica was the minister of my church. The ministers up on that time was all white. They were sent from Britain to run the church. I was in a congregational church. The point is that when I arrived in London, seeing lots of white people, seeing some black people, and then, when I was rejected as being educationally subnormal, and then my mom and I, we went to church, and the local church, everybody there was white, and the minister told us not to come back. So this is one of the things I've not said before.
Wow.
But this happened. The minister actually told us not to come back because we were affecting his congregation, meaning that people would stop coming to church. And that led to a lot of black churches being set up because they felt that, they had to have their own church. But that did happen. And so all these things were happening. You walk past a shop and you see there were posters. People now refer to it sort of, I noticed black historians are talking about the posters which used to be in the windows. No blacks, no Irish, no dogs.
Wow.
In terms of accommodation, that was in the shop window. So I walked past that. That's not a historical document to me. I saw it in the shop window. That was quite normal. And, you would go to again, this is something I've not said before, but you're walking past a shop or you go into a pub, and the next thing you know, somebody's throwing bottles of stuff at you, and you have to run. So, all these things were happening, but again, I didn't put them down to race. I didn't put them down to any difference. To me, it's just having a difficult time, and you knew what to avoid. There were notices on the side of the road. Where my mom lived, and we lived near Pentonville Prison. And Pentonville Prison was a prison where they hang people. It was the hanging prison, and if I looked out my window and looked up the road, I could see the walls of Pentonville. So that's where we lived, in terms of accommodation. We couldn't live anywhere else because the rent was half my mother's salary. And she was on about, at one time, I think it was £5, and she was paying £2.50, half her salary for rent. So we were living on £2.50 when I was at school. I did paper rounds in the mornings to help, her to pay the bills and stuff. So all that was going on, and I didn't put it down to whether it was race or to history or anything, because I wasn't familiar with that. And on the wall, when you got out the door there, and there's a big writing on the wall, KBW, Keep Britain White.
Wow.
That was written on the wall in white paint. That was something that, again, you saw, but it was no big deal because you weren't aware of the consequences.
Right.
You see what I mean? These were things were happening.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who talk about this history don't understand that. You see, a lot of historians, they've heard it. They've not spoken to somebody who's been through it.
Yeah.
Like I have. So to me, this was just nothing really. It was just these guys were doing that. As long as nobody was harming me physically, it didn't bother me. And so eventually when I got myself, educated in a way, then left London and then went to Leicester. Then we had certain meetings at Leicester. There were political discussions about class. It wasn't about race. We had no discussion in the 60s at Leicester about race. And so therefore I went through Leicester without really discussing race as such.
Wow.
We had an international society and we had meetings and parties, but we weren't discussing race. When you consider in the 60s, I also went through Enoch Powell, who was the politician who was saying rivers of blood if they don't leave. People like Nabarro and Griffiths, these guys were politicians who were wanting black people to leave. Didn't bother me. I didn't see it as anything threatening. Again, because I had this sort of resilience that, from my aunts and going to church and stuff, the only people I was frightened of are people in the Bible. I wasn't frightened of anybody outside it. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It was that kind of resilience I had. But when I came to Edinburgh in '64, after I had that interview, and then when I came, people were interesting because they weren't used to black people. They were used to students, I noticed when I came. So the black students were from Africa or from the Caribbean, but they were to me elite. You see, so they wouldn't realize that. I came from London. They came from Nigeria or Ghana or Jamaica or Trinidad. They were here on scholarships. They knew each other. This is something which I'm giving you, which I've not discussed.
Wow.
What fascinated me about them, even though when I came, I'm seeing these people who were supposed to be my people, and I'm sitting with them in a restaurant in Edinburgh, the barbecue, or whatever, or they come over from Glasgow, and we're all in Edinburgh, and they didn't know much about me because I was an immigrant. I came on a banana boat. They flew over on planes. They were from Nigeria North or Nigeria South. And I found it fascinating because I live in Jamaica and I didn't know somebody 5 miles away. They came from Nigeria, from different cities, different places, and they knew of each other because they knew each other's families, because their families were so important politically or socially. So they would say, "Are you from X?" And somebody would say, "Oh, yes, my dad knew your dad," because they were both at university together. Whereas that's something I didn't know. And I found that fascinating. So I began to look at the social differences amongst ourselves as migrants. And then when I went out on the street, because I was looking for accommodation, I would apply for somewhere to get a room. And when I arrived at the place, they told me the room was taken. So when I phoned, the room was available. But when I arrived, it was not available. And therefore, I realized there was now a rejection, which you didn't have in London because we were living at black people's houses. So they, was living in a house owned by a Caribbean person. So it wasn't a big problem. But when I came here having to live with a white landlady or a landlord, then it presented this. I could see there was a difference that as an issue, a difference of superiority and inferiority. I begin to detect that. And that then we had debates and discussions, and we started at the university in Edinburgh. I was at the Heriot-Watt, but I knew all the other students were Edinburgh. And we were discussing this history of the past. And so slavery came up and I had to start reading about it because I knew nothing about it. And there were some of the Jamaicans who were fair-skinned enough to have Scottish relatives. So, some of them knew their Scottish relatives from 200 years ago.
Wow.
That they knew they had, there was somebody called MacFarlane, and she was aware of her Scottish relatives who were in Jamaica 200 years ago. They were still here. So again, I began to deal with this history in that way. It was almost a personal development. And then I started to read. You can see the books around the house from the 1960s. And when I left Scotland in 1968, I then went and worked at a research institute in Surrey, in England. And then, I realized then there was this race thing. And there was this view that black people were not as smart as white people. And I began to pick it up in terms of the institute I worked in at Reading. It was Red Hill, just outside Reading, a place called Nutfield. And it was owned by the brewers. And my job was to do research on barley, because I did my PhD up here. So when I was in Scotland, I did a PhD, and the PhD officially is an Edinburgh University PhD, although I did the research at the area ward. So my time in Scotland, 64 to 68, I picked up the hints about slavery, but I also picked up the difference between my background as a black person from Jamaica and a black person from Africa or a black person from the Caribbean. That there was a difference between me and them, because they had a certain elitism about them, which of course came from private schools and from families who were fairly well placed, whereas I came from a family who was not well placed, and that we had to work our way through London, through prejudices which we didn't even understand. There were fascists in London too, such as Oswald Mosley, who was anti-Jewish, but he also was anti-black. But all that didn't bother me. When I came to Scotland, I began to pick up this difference between myself and black people and myself and white people. This is the irony of it. So when I went to the Research Institute in 68 with a PhD, I was given the job to do research on barley. And I started that research. And one thing I learned, because people have asked me about this, how did you manage yourself, and because I'm on my own. I realized that if I did something important scientifically, then they can't touch me. And it's what I call, it's off the street. It's the sort of thing my aunt would have taught me. Do something important, boy, because they can't touch you if you do that. So with my research, and there's something I've not said before, I developed a strategy of I've got to do, the work I do has got to be at a significant level. And this is going to be part of my protection.
Wow.
I started to research, looking at the grain, looked at the work I did in Edinburgh, and I came up with a concept which is called barley abrasion. You will have seen it on my thing. So what is it? When I worked in Edinburgh with a PhD, I realized that the concept, which was worldwide, on how the grain worked, the research I did said it wasn't right. And put it simply, the general concept of how the grain worked to change itself from barley to malt, which is a multi-million-pound industry, is that the germ digested the grain. So it changed it into sugar. And the sugar is used to make beer and whiskey. That's how fermentation of the grain is. Fundamentally, it's that. So the grain has no sugar initially. You grow it, germinate it, it digested itself, and you get the sugar and the other nutrients required for the yeast to change it into whiskey or beer. That's the process. And when I did my research here, despite all what was going on outside, I realized that I don't think that was right. The germ didn't do it. In fact, the tissue that surrounds the starch, which was digested, it's the tissue around that completely encloses the grain, most of it. And we eat it today. It's called the bran.
Bran flakes.
The bran flakes now take on a new value. When you eat your bran flakes, think of it.
Wow.
Because that saved me. That changed the technology of this industry and how it worked. Because the information I had told me that it was the bran that digested the grain, not the germ. But I was struggling because, you see, you could take the germ off and it produced enzymes that you would digest. So the view was from the big companies around the world, Heineken or Carlsberg. Carlsberg published a lot on it, saying it's not, what he's saying is not right, because you can take the germ off by itself and it produces enzymes. So how can he be saying the enzyme doesn't do it? The embryo doesn't do anything, because when you take the embryo off, you can get enzymes. What they didn't realize, and it's like in life, you've got to look carefully. When you take the germ off of a grain, it is contaminated with bran. Nobody's looked. Nobody's ever looked. When you take a germ off, it's contaminated with bran. Thus, it will behave like bran. And I can tell you, the criticism I had was just like the history criticism, which I will come to, because it's exactly the same. And today I'll link the two, because I've not done that in literature or anything before. So I was criticized worldwide, and it was dangerous for me at work, because my boss, and my wife will tell you, by then, we were married, and she will tell you, she said, I came home for 7 days once and spoke to nobody, because my boss told me, because I had this concept, and I said, the brand did it. And what we can do to improve the whole thing is to stimulate the brand as much as we can. Don't stimulate the germ, because the germ is minor. And he said, but the whole world saying is this, and the whole world said. And he said, well, you better be right, because I'm going to get rid of you if you're wrong. So I was working in a situation in my first job, and that was a threat. If I were wrong, then I'm in trouble. And the senior boss, the director, came down to visit me one day. And Dr. Cook was the man who worked on penicillin. So he was no minnow. And Dr. Cook came down to my lab, and he said, how is the work going, Palmer? I always called you by your surname. I'll never call you by your first name. He even called his sister Miss Cook. She lived on the same site as he did, and he called her Miss Cook. No, you've got a history there, because he is very famous, Dr. A.H. Cook. He's one of the men who worked on penicillin to work out its structure. So he was my ultimate boss at the Institute. And he just asked me, because he was talking to my boss, and Dr. Cook said, how is it going? And I said, it's fine, Dr. Cook. I don't think the germ does it. And he said, so what do you intend to do? And I said, I'm going to try and stimulate the bran, because that should make the grain go faster. And he just said, okay. He walked out. And I then, as my mother would say, as God would have it, I found a mill in the attic of the Institute. And it's a little mill that when you put grain in it, you can pearl it. If you keep turning it, it completely takes all the skin off the grain, completely. So you're just left with the pearl. You can buy pearl barley. Right. Instead of doing it for half an hour or whatever to pearl it, I did it 10 times. Only 10. And I took the grain out. They looked exactly the same. But when I looked at it very carefully, it started to damage the grain at the back end, not the germ end. It's where the bran is, goes round. It starts to scrape the grain at the back. And then I checked, because there's a hormone that is produced in the grain that triggers enzymes. We knew that. And you could buy that hormone. So I bought some of that hormone, put it on the grain, and it started to digest itself from both ends. Both ends. because when it's doing it from one end, the germ produces the hormone, it doesn't produce the enzymes. And that hormone stimulates the bran to produce the enzymes. So if I get the hormone, I could stimulate the bran without the germ doing a thing, because that's all the germ does. And of course, if the germ is producing some hormone, and I can put it at the back as well, then the grain is going to digest as if it's got two germs, front and back. And when I noticed that, I said to my boss, I think I've got the answer. And he said, okay. And then what he did, he said, have you analyzed it? And I said, no, I haven't. I haven't really processed it yet, but I think it should be better than the present situation by far. And then he stopped the laboratory analyzing anything I produce. So I couldn't check it. Wow. He stopped the analysis. But I processed it anyway. So I had the grain ready for analysis in about a month or so, without any analysis. And then he came to me one day and I said, I've processed the grain, they're ready for analysis. And he said, have you still got that view? I said, yes, I have. He said, okay, we'll analyze it. And if it isn't as you say, then you're in some trouble. So he analyzed it. And it was exactly what I said. It was better. It was, you could process the abraded grain in 2 days earlier than the normal. So the normal took 10 days, it took 8. So that's 2 days, every 8 days saved on a process. That's an enormous amount of money. But it also helped the industry because they were struggling. The people who produce their own grain, like the brewers, big companies like Watney Truman's, Bass Charrington's, Allied Breweries who owned brewery in Alloa. Those companies made their own malt, although they bought. So if they could make their own, they would buy less. If they could make their own quicker. And that's what the abrasion process did. It allowed big companies to make their own malt quicker. That didn't make me very popular with the producers of malt. It didn't make me popular with them when I suggested sorghum could be used in Nigeria, because they were selling malt to Nigeria. And of course, the sorghum covered that. So I've always been unpopular with the work I do, in a sense that when you are being innovative, it's risky. And I find that even with history today, somebody was telling me not long ago that you're the one who's challenging the historical truths about we can't, because we'll have something to lose. Because if we say it, then our boss may not like it and we might lose our jobs. So therefore, we're in a world where somebody can see something that's wrong, but it's not in their interest to challenge it. And they don't. And therefore, that's something I will not accept. And my family knows that. So this was how I did my research. These were the risks I took. And when the abrasion process was used by industry and showed that it worked, my boss, who was threatening me, I can show you there that the second publication I published on this, he put his name on it. He put his name on it. And therefore, that's the nature. I didn't mind, I didn't care. The point is he'd lost the argument. And as long as I worked at that institute, I knew I was protected, because what I'd done turned out to be correct. The irony is, although industry used it, etc., somebody in, I think it's Australia, published a paper in 2017 This is 1968 to the 70s. Somebody was still producing a paper. And I think what it is, I don't think people can accept that a black person had done that. Because the concept of black people being inferior is still in the heads of black and white people. And that came from David Hume, the man sitting on the high street with his big statue. Edinburgh University took his name off a building, the Hume Tower. And what we have today is that is still important. So if I go from the scientific difficulties, because it is similar to the ones on history, because it's me challenging established views. And somehow they'd rather have the inefficiency and the lack of knowledge than accept the truth from me or anybody else, which they don't accept. And therefore, when I started to look at the history, is that I had all these experiences of living in London at Leicester University, where we didn't do very much because race wasn't that big an issue, despite we had Enoch Powell and people actually saying they want us out the country. It's because it didn't affect me in terms of my culture. I didn't think it was a big deal, and they weren't attacking me personally, so it didn't bother me. But when I came to Edinburgh, I became more aware of it. So when I came back to Edinburgh the second time in 77, and I was going to live here now, things had changed a bit, because students, the Scottish population knew that when you come as a student, you're leaving. You're not here permanently. So the attitude was different. So they saw you just as a temporary resident. Right? You believe it or not, is that changed when I came back in the 70s. You could see that's different from the 60s. Because there were people now who they knew were staying, were not leaving. Not leaving. So the attitudes towards people from the colonies had changed. It was more aggressive. It was more negative. And that surprised me. In fact, on this road, the wee little girl used to come over here when I came in 77. And she used to say to my wife, "Can Geoff come out and play?" And I used to go out and play with the children on the road. But one day she came over with the other children and she said to me, "Do you know what my dad said about you, sir?" And I said, "No, what did he say?" She said, "My dad said, do you know Geoff over there? He's going to put the price of my house down." Out of the mouths of babes. The point is that she was saying what was the common, probably, view along the road at the time. That, and it was a view in England, that when you had a black person who bought a house next to you, you'd put the value of yours down. That's right. And the little girl was telling me that. That's what her dad said. The irony, when he left not long ago, because they were still living here, he was involved in the Joseph Knight case, where that was a case in Scotland, where the outcome in 1778 is taken by historians at the highest level and by people in our society at the highest level, that Scotland abolished slavery with that case. And therefore, I was aware of all that. And so I thought the story of James Weatherburn going to Jamaica, buying Inverse Lodge, and his brother in that powerful case where the black servant Joseph Knight was released, was taken that Scotland abolished slavery. I thought that wasn't true. And it had to be said that it wasn't true. So I set up a walk from Musselburgh to Inverse Lodge in 2007. 200 years of the commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade, 2007. That walk. And a lot of people came. But part of that walk was critical because James Weatherburn, when he was in Jamaica, had slaves. And he had a mixed race slave, with a mixed race son, of course, who was a slave, called Robert Weatherburn. And he's now a national hero of black people, especially Caribbean people, who know about him. Because he's the son of James Weatherburn, who bought the house, white Scots, who bought the house. And Robert Weatherburn found out his father lived in Inverse Lodge from Jamaica. Somebody or James Weatherburn must have told him, but the mixed race children had the opportunity of leaving Jamaica. So James Weatherburn's son turned up at Inverse Lodge, Robert Weatherburn. And Robert Weatherburn is an activist, one of the earliest black activists in Britain. And he challenged the system. He questioned the church. He questioned the fact why black people were slaves in Jamaica. He came to visit his father at Inverse Lodge and he told him to go away. He went away. But my walk, I invited a descendant of Robert Weatherburn, Lord Bill Weatherburn. And Lord Bill Weatherburn was an academic. And he admitted that he's descended from Robert Weatherburn, the mixed race slave. And he came up to Edinburgh and accompanied me on that walk. Lord Bill Weatherburn, the descendant of the mixed race slave. Wow. And he died recently, but he came and we went to Inverse Lodge and we celebrated that event. So that's how I started. That when you're doing this activism, you've got to do things like that. Yeah. Because then everybody was paying attention. This was something they didn't know. And we did a walk to establish it. Politicians became interested. I then challenged the Joseph Knight case. And I said, this case has, if Joseph Knight wasn't a slave, why did you abolish slavery? How could you? And that got historians on my back, because that's been around for since 1778. Wow. Since 1778, it's taught in law. If you did a law degree in Scotland, you would be taught that. And I said, Joseph Knight wasn't a slave. He was a servant who was brought back from Jamaica. But there was no slavery in Scotland, so how could he be a slave? And a professor said he was an enslaved servant. That's an oxymoron. It's nonsense. And thus the attack on me started, just like with the barley. Oh, he's not a historian. He's not a professional historian. He's a brewer. He's this. And that was the negativity. But it didn't bother me, and I still persisted. And the point is that then I turned to the Henry Dundas statue. And I read that plaque, and I said, that plaque is not true. And that started again the criticism. I got the council interested with another guy called Ramsey, and we set up a committee to look at the plaque. We got nowhere because the historians said they're not historians. And the things they've said, you can read it. It's all in the press anyway. However, George Floyd died sadly. And I spoke at one of the rallies and I said, one of the things we should do is change that plaque. The council eventually listened, and that narrative I read you there, the plaque has been changed. it says exactly what he did. He gradually abolished the slave trade in order to benefit slave owners. Because if they couldn't have slaves, they couldn't run their plantations. Thus, he had to keep the trade going. And I've actually dug up his work. My son in London has sent me some of those books. And I have actually worked out where he said himself that you cannot abolish the slave trade. I've got one of his letters where he says he's going to oppose the abolition of the slave trade. And what he was going to do was going to try and ensure that the slaves can breed themselves more easily. He was going to get girls of 16 and boys of 21, no older. If they were older, they would cause rebellion. So if you can't have a trade, you've got to encourage breeding. Now, other people didn't like me saying all that, but it's true. I've got it in writing. And that changed the attitude. And we got the plaque. And since that plaque has been up, we've had the criticism from the family and from other historians. So exactly what happened with the barley work is what happened with the history work. The point is that people don't want the truth. And what I will end with is that they don't want the truth from certain sources. This is how I see it. And it's almost like, what right have you got to be telling us that? It's a bit of that. And I think the truth has no color. The truth has no race. A 4 is a 4. However, we've got to the race situation. And what I will end with is that in 1753, David Hume got up out of his bed and said Negroes are inferior to whites. People were shocked when I said it. But I was making up anything new. He said it. You type it now on your phone, it's there. What did David Hume say about black people? Negroes were inferior to whites. That is the essence of our problem. Because that was taken up by Immanuel Kant and turned into the Negro race is inferior to white. And that is a complete myth because there is no evidence for that Negroes are inferior to white. They've tried using IQ tests in the 60s. I think the psychologists did that. So the 60s was plagued with IQ tests in America and in Europe to try to prove that Hume and Kant, because if they could do that, then we were in trouble. Because that would say this is a fact. Because that was used to enslave African people. Yeah. You read some of the documents from that period. Yes, we can enslave them because they are inferior. They don't understand complexities. They don't have the capacity as white people. And what I've challenged that with is to say, give me the evidence. I said the irony is you won't give the people in Benin back their masks and bronzes because they're too sophisticated. You were saying they're inferior. How could they have made those? And therefore, these are the ironies of the myth. Yeah. And therefore, we now must look at the consequences of the so-called Enlightenment, where so-called the great minds of Hume and Kant and other philosophers, as they were called, have spread this around. The point is that the consequences of that is racism. That's what killed Floyd. That's what that little boy got shot in the head recently. The point is that we've got to speak that truth, and that truth has got to be acknowledged. And it's happening because big companies have spoken to me, whether it's the Royal Bank, whether it's Bailey Gifford, or whether it's Morgan Stanley or whatever. A lot of companies have spoken to me. and they're looking now at their representation in their company. And, and that is very important. I'm going to London next week to speak to black doctors who I don't know. They just contacted me by email, and I'm going to speak. And I've been to Liverpool, and I'm speaking at the University of Greenwich by Zoom, and I have to cancel a meeting because the kids in Hackney heard I was coming. God knows how they know to London. And they're saying, can I come to Hackney and speak to them? The point is the truth works. And people are now listening, and the work you are doing and what you will put out, people will read. And the point is that they can check it. So they can check what I've said. They can check Kant, they can check Hume, they can check the Weatherbins. You put out the names, they can check them. And they will find exactly what I say are there. And that is the power of what I call, and when people say to me about statues, I said the next statue down should be racism. Until you take that down, leave all the others up. When you've taken down the statue of racism, tell me, and we can discuss the others. And, so that's one of my views. And the other one is, we're one humanity. Nobody can prove otherwise. Skin color is different, but your heart is closer to mine than my family's. And your heart is closer to the white person on the other side of the road than his heart is to his family who are white. That's the importance of our similarity. When we spend a lot of time looking at a pigment. And millions of people have died because of a pigment. That is the horror of this history, which must not continue. The horror of this history is people have died because of a pigment. When we can take each other's hearts. To me, that's where we've got to move on now from the past, and I think we are. And Glasgow University has done something to help. Edinburgh Council has, and so have the museums. I've done projects and advisory work with them, and we're moving on. So, we are one humanity, nothing less. What I've done for you, I think, is to try and link, which I've not done in other interviews, is to link the scientific difficulties with the historical differences. And what it is, it's the attitude, even though you're at work, and of course now I'm a free agent, is that people object to us making an important point about what they think is their business. And that is it's no business of theirs. It belongs to all of us. And thus this idea that if you were putting out your podcast or whatever, and it's effective, somebody would say, but he's not an expert at podcasts. So despite the content is valuable, they're saying, oh no, he's you don't have to listen to that because he's just an amateur. He doesn't really know what he's doing. And that's why what we do has got to be of such that it carries something new. And what I've tried to do today is to link so you could see it. Because if I didn't do that, and if I just talked about the statues, it would be just part of the story about me. And a lot of people have not got both to show the difficulties is not to do with you have somebody with the capacity, but nevertheless, we've got people in our society who are working against their own society. They'd rather me not have done my research and not have done the history work, even though it's of value to the country. You see what I mean? And that kind of attitude, and the phrase I use, which was used by the various other people now, is that, and I will use it on yours, and I will say it, is, I'm saying that it's a sort of statement where I say, you cannot change the past, but you can change consequences of the past, such as racism, for the better, using education. And to me, that's the essence of it, that we can change the consequences, but education is important to effect that change. And thus, I just had a meeting with an MSP in the Scottish Parliament, and we all came to the conclusion that this history must be taught in the curriculum, and it must be taught truthfully and honestly, without any balance. Because one of the balances which people are now using, and this is the fight back, if you're going to put it that way, by the what I call the white negative establishment, is to say, but yes, okay, we were involved in this slavery, and we were, but Africans sold the slaves, so the Africans are responsible. So that is a view that has been put forward, and at the highest level. And my response to that has been, I was talking to somebody last night, and they were going into complications. I said, all slaveries are wrong. Doesn't matter what you call them. However, you've got to define your slaveries, just like you have to define race. The slavery we're talking about was illegal. It had to be abolished because it was illegal. And when it was abolished, the slave owners got £20 million. It's about 20 billion today. And 47,000 people were involved in that compensation. 47,000. And Scotland was almost overrepresented in terms of its population size. And those are facts. And I then would say to them, who in Africa was conducting this slavery on a legal government control basis? I'm not arguing, defending it. And if you are a superior country, how can you legalize something like that? The point is that the legality by a parliament of something like that is what the issue is about. Modern slavery, now people will bring that up as well. Modern slavery is criminality. It's against the law. Our slavery wasn't. It was the law. And those are the fundamental differences. And at the end, I will say, as far as I know, there weren't African ships at Leith or coming up the Clyde selling slaves. As far as I know, there were no African ships in the Clyde or in the Thames or at Liverpool selling slaves. What I do know, there were hundreds of British ships over many hundreds of years picking up slaves in Africa. So if their ships weren't down there, there'd be no transport to anywhere. And therefore, that isn't an argument as such. I just want to point out the reality that nobody should be bought or sold. But the ships were down there getting slaves, whether they were buying or I don't know how they bought them, whether it's money or goods in exchange. But the ships were down there. There weren't African ships here. But nevertheless, all slaveries are wrong. However, slavery is a word used. And therefore, the slavery you're describing must be defined so that we can know what was happening. It should not be now used as an excuse to try and negate, diminish, nullify what happened by saying the Arabs were selling slaves and the Africans were selling slaves, because that is not a valid response. And when I said to somebody last night, they said, well, you can say that, we can't, because we don't want to get into difficulties. But if that isn't said, then in fact, that will remain as a valid balance. And you've got a professor at Oxford called Professor Bigger. That's his view. He's saying, he published in the Times 2 weeks ago, and I have responded on Twitter. This is one of the most senior professors. He's the professor of moral theology, something like that, of moral theology, or something like that. And he's saying that Britain only benefited. Now, I'm going to quote it, and it's absolutely correct. He said Britain gained occasional benefits from slavery. Occasional. It went on for about 300 years. A professor at Oxford actually said the benefits were occasional. Again, I said to somebody last night, why hasn't anybody challenged that? I'm the only person to have said that is a disgrace. That is a disgrace. And then he goes on to say, well, it was an occasion, but the British Navy defended slavery. Or, no, they defended the abolition. That's what he was trying to say. The British, by using the Navy after the abolition of the slave trade, I'll make that clear. After the British abolished the slave trade, the British Navy tried to stop other people continuing the slave trade. And that's supposed to be worth the enslavement for hundreds of years. The British Navy stopped other people continuing the slave trade. And when you look at it very carefully, historically, the British had the Navy, but they didn't do a good job of stopping it because the Americans continued, and the Brazilians continued, and the Cubans continued long after British slave trade was abolished. Long after the British slave trade was abolished, even with the Navy, the Americans continued to buy slaves. In fact, they encouraged it to a certain degree. And the Brazilians were still enslaving people, taking them down to Brazil by the thousands and thousands. And the Cubans were doing it. So therefore, this argument is now the argument. And therefore, that should be dealt with. That should be stated, that you cannot use this so-called balance. Africans did it. They were involved. They even brought in David Livingstone, that he was involved in Africa and he knew about slavery and didn't do much about it. So therefore, he and the Africans are involved. Can you imagine? That's an argument. But we can't leave anything outstanding, because even if it's a sentence, one has got to say the excuse of Africans selling slaves is no excuse for this horror that went on for 300 years and was illegal within this country, a country that the individuals saw themselves as superior. So again, the war, what you're doing is important, because the acknowledgement that this happened is there. No, they can't deny it. It's now we're looking for the excuses to balance it, to say that it was done, but it was okay. You know, we didn't get all that much from it. And we abolished it, and we then policed it. Nothing of the sort. That's a myth. The fact is that this slavery was pushed by the Parliament. It was legal. Nobody said a word in terms of petitions until they really started the abolition. And then one of the most powerful statements against gradual abolition. Two people, and these are British. One was an abolitionist called Clarkson. And what Clarkson said, that Dundas was the main instrument against the abolition of the slave trade. He was the main instrument against Wilberforce. And that's written. Clarkson said that. And he's one of the most important abolitionists of the whole lot. And that's written over there, where Clarkson said that. The other point is Fox, an MP at the time. And what Fox said about gradual abolition, it was like gradual murder. There can be no such thing. And he said it. It's like carrying that out. He had I can't quote him exactly, but that was what he was getting at. Therefore, it was no excuse to do that. And finally, on this aspect, I will read you what the Prime Minister at the time said about gradual. That's Dundas's Prime Minister. That's Pitt. You know, the younger Pitt, who was the character who was running the world because he was Prime Minister of Britain. Dundas worked for him. Dundas was Minister of the War and Home Secretary, etc. His boss was Pitt. And what did Pitt say about gradual? By waiting for some contingency, or by refusing to proceed till 1,000 favourable circumstances unite together. And then he goes on to say, year after year escapes, and the most enormous evils go unredressed. That's the Prime Minister at the time saying gradual meant waiting for some contingency. That means you're waiting for something that you know nothing about. How long is that? And the other one is by refusing to proceed till 1,000 favourable circumstances unite. When is ever 1,000 favourable circumstances in your life is ever going to, or anybody's life, is ever going to come together? What he's saying, it meant never. Gradual was not going to happen until they wanted it to happen. Gradual meant never for the slaves. They had to depend on the powers that be when they regard 1,000 circumstances have united. And therefore, his iniquity was known at the time. The Prime Minister says it. So what the historians are trying to defend with excuses, it was the French Revolution, that's why he did it. What it was, you needed slaves because they were dying young and early in their lives. And they can't be bred fast enough. And therefore you need to delay until you put that strategy in place. That's what the gradual was about. So we've got the Prime Minister telling us we don't need anybody else. And this is the kind of work I've had to do. And it's my son who sent me this what I've just read is in that book, which is tattered. This is one volume of 4 volumes. And this is a rarity. I don't know if there's another. My son bought it and sent it to me. These 4 volumes. And these are the speeches of Prime Minister Pitt during his lifetime. He's regarded as one of the most significant prime ministers ever. Because he was there at the French Revolution. He was there at the height of colonial power. and therefore these are his speeches. And what I've just read there came from this book. And you can see how tatty it is, see how much I've read it. The other 3 volumes I've not touched. But that is where my, and I say evidence comes from, that I would not, in fact, say something unless, in fact, I can go back and check it. And there are all those books. There's even one there by William Hague, the past Prime Minister, because he's written a book on Pitt, William Pitt. And he actually quotes that phrase I've just read. William Hague, ex-British, I think he was Prime Minister. I can't remember. He was in the Conservative Party, very senior. And he has written a book on Pitt, and he quotes that phrase I've just read. So the point is that, you know, William Hague knows it, and it's in his book, but it's never ever quoted by anybody else. Yes, sir. You know, and it, to me, again, this is how do we deal with that? So I'll check William Hague. I don't think he may have been Prime Minister, may have been not, but he was very senior in the Conservative government. But that's his book over there, and it's very important because he deals with, even when Dundas was going to be impeached. Now, this is the irony. Here's a man who controlled the world in a way. You know, Britain owned 1/5 of the world. It was painted in red when I was a wee boy at school, so we knew it. British Empire, all red, 1/5 of the world. And, you know, you were in a situation where this man was controlling that. And then, although I was called a brewer, to denigrate what I'm saying, oh, he's just a brewer, don't listen to him. Which, to me, it's insulting to brewers. Like, some of my students are so wealthy as brewers. You know, like, I don't know if you know, you've heard of Brewdog, the beer?
Yes.
Brewdog, they're very successful. They're all over the world now. They're based in Aberdeen. That's their headquarters. And there are 2 owners. Well, one of the owners is my student. And Stuart Brewing in Edinburgh, he's my student. So my students have done very well. And they're all over the world. All over the world, my students. The point is that there is a man, somebody's then trying to denigrate what I'm saying, to negate it, by saying he's just a brewer, just ignore him. The interesting thing, the irony of that is, Henry Dundas was impeached in 1806 because Samuel Whitbread, who was a brewer, found out that he had taken Navy's money. So here's a man in charge of the Navy. That's Trafalgar, Nelson, Rodney. You know, there's a street in Edinburgh called Rodney Street. I'm told there's one in Glasgow as well. Rodney Street. Those streets are significant. Why? Because in 1782, the French decided they were going to take Jamaica from Britain. Because Jamaica was providing over 50% of the income from the slavery empire. Jamaica was providing more money than America. So the French thought if they could take Jamaica from Britain, they would change the economics at the time. So I would be today speaking French. You probably wouldn't be here. Because you'd be part of France. And the French decided they were going to take Jamaica. Yeah. And the British sent down 2 men to protect Jamaica, Rodney and Hood. So that's why you have Rodney Street. Because they went down in 1782 and defeated the French. The French lost and wounded 3,000 men in 3 days. And that battle is mentioned by Robert Burns. In 1793, 11 years later, Burns actually said, here's a toast to the boys we lost. in the Battle of the Glorious 12. May their fame last until the world goes round. The point is that we've never got that history of Rodney Street and we don't know. The irony is Rodney Street runs into the Naval Club. Both in Edinburgh, when I went to Glasgow to give a talk, somebody said to me in the audience, only a few months ago, we also have a Rodney Street in Glasgow and it runs into the Naval Club. So we have our history around us and we don't know the relationship between Rodney, Jamaica, British economics, African slavery, and the Naval Club. And it's in a street next to where we live. Nobody's told us. Nobody's told anybody about that history. So therefore, in terms of Dundas, the point is, the irony about me again, he was impeached by a brewer, Samuel Whitbread. And you know who the Whitbreads are? They used to be brewers in Bedford in England, and they made Heineken. But they've been a very powerful family. There's a Samuel Whitbread Academy who contacted us in Scotland, and we had a meeting. And what I'm telling them about Samuel Whitbread, they didn't know. And they've got a school called the Whitbread Academy. And you know what the Whitbread owns today? Same family. Premier Inn. Wow. And Beefeater. Wow. Same family. I said this last night and people were, because they couldn't link the history with today. Yeah, I said the family's still there. They still own that.
Wow, I didn't know that. Premier Inn and
linked to the Whitbread, yeah. So again, you know, this history, if when people know it, it makes things so much clearer. And again, finally, we're Burns again, people, because I'm now the Burns ambassador. This is the irony. I'm the Burns, and I've got to respond to the Burns Club in Stonehaven. They want me to come and give a talk next year. And the point is that you look at your Burns, he was going to go to Jamaica in 1786 to be, as he called it himself, a slave driver. But he didn't go. But if you look at his work carefully, he mentions it. So he talks about the Rodney victory. Here's a toast to the boys we lost. He's talking about the British sailors who died. He also, in his poem, Ode Sacred to Mrs. Oswald of Auchencrew, that's the Oswald family, who are still about today. You know, they've got a stained glass window in the cathedral. There's a stained glass window to, I think, Buchanan, the slave person, slave agent. There's a stained glass window in the cathedral to him. And therefore, Burns, if you look at your Burns carefully, which a lot of people didn't realize, in his poem, Ode Sacred to the Memory of Mrs. Oswald of Auchencrew, probably the most two powerful lines of avarice ever written are there. And what are they? Or we can say there are three. In that poem, when I checked, Burns says, hands, he's talking about now slavers, hands never stretch to save. Never stretch to save. Hands that took, but never gave. Hands that took, but never gave. That's in that poem, describing Mrs. Oswald, whose husband was the notorious slave owner who owned Barnes Island of Sierra Leone, from which he sold slaves. He's recorded in that poem in terms of the money. And that Auchencrew house, where they lived, is still there. Anybody can go and visit it. And the inside is luxurious. You can see what, I think I've got a picture of I took some photographs, and on the computers, you know, they come up all together. So I've got a picture, I'll show it to you, of inside of that house when I went on a visit on my own. I just was curious. I drove there. And They wouldn't let me in. And I said, I own it. I don't think they understood the irony. I said, my ancestors bought all this stuff. Are you telling me I can't go in? So this is the sort of difficulties I create. No wonder they're going to sue me. But anyway, Dundas's impeachment. It was Samuel Whitbread who effected his impeachment in 1806, ended his career. He never held another senior post, although people say, oh, well, but the House of Lords let him off. He was impeached. And that impeachment in 1806 finished his political career, and the slave trade was abolished in 1807. 1806, he was impeached. Slave trade abolished in 1807. Historians don't regard that. They say it's just chance. He was impeached. He put that order of the delay in 1792. It went on till 1807. He was impeached in 1806 for taking the Navy's money when he was Treasurer of the Navy. Treasurer. And thus had ended his career. So as my mother says, you know, there is a higher power dealing with these things.
That we expect.
The irony of that is it wasn't brought about by any great political act or military act. He was discovered taking the Navy's money, and that ended his career. And that brought about the abolition of the slave trade the following year.
2 or 3 more questions, and then we'll open up to questions from our team. For young people that are getting involved in activism recently and in science, what would your advice be to people looking to get more involved in activism?
I think the main thing about activism, they call it activism. If you're an academic, they call it academic. But if you're not an academic, they call it activism. And it's nothing to be concerned about. My activism, it only could be described in I try to make myself ready. And that means you cannot defend people or yourself. If you have an interest in something, it means you have to be capable of defending it. And defending it means educating yourself. Just talking emotionally doesn't work. And some people do harm with weapons and some people do harm with words. And therefore, to me, if I have taken on this responsibility to speak on behalf of the past, then my responsibility is to make sure that I am as knowledgeable as possible, or else I'm being irresponsible. And the only thing why people now have given me a bit of focus, I said, I'm not very good, but I'm popular because I'm free or cheap. But you can't always assess your popularity. The point is that I make sure that if you want to be an activist, whatever it's called, make absolutely certain that you are capable of defending the people you are out to defend. And that means reading, checking, making sure that you are capable of doing that.
So educating oneself and getting prepared to defend
Be
everything
ready.
you say.
It's the Scouts' motto, isn't it?
Yeah.
Be prepared.
Absolutely.
Be prepared. And that is all it takes. It's hard work for some.
Yes, sir.
But it is, when somebody says something to me, like a top historian say it was the French Revolution, I said, I've got a document here where Dundas says the French were rubbish. He was no fear of the French. He was more fearful of an African person, an older African person, because they were likely to cause rebellions.
Yeah.
So Dundas was more afraid of African elders or elder people from Africa
Yes, sir.
than he was from the French. navy or army, because these Africans were causing rebellions. And he couldn't afford to have a rebellion like the Sharp Rebellion, you know, where the slaves went around killing people. And of course, they hanged Sam Sharp in 1832. So a lot of the Africans who caused rebellions were hanged, like Taki was hanged.
Wow.
Bogle, this is post-slavery, Bogle and Gordon. Very Scottish names. Bogle is very Western Scotland. Bogle and Gordon fomented a rebellion in 1865, and they were both hanged. So Sharp, Bogle, Gordon, Taki, all hanged for fomenting rebellions.
Wow.
So an activist, if you're going to be an activist, you've got to be ready to defend.
Yes, sir.
And the only weapon you have are valid words.
Valid words. All right, sir. On a slightly different note, you've been recognized with numerous awards for your contributions to science and also to the society, a knighthood, and also like several different honors. How do you define success, and how has that definition changed over the years?
Success to me would mean, when I figured out the abrasion process, to me, that is something which nature had been concealing. And I would see that. So it's a battle against nature. To me, I'm not bothered about battles against people. To me, that was a battle. And to me, that's about success. Another success is, helping to persuade the council to change that plaque. And therefore, to me, success is about, again, changing an attitude in society, changing something which wasn't true, for people to see the truth. And thus, the truth was also about the science. So to me, success is about getting people to see what is true in nature. And if you can do that, you will find that that will be of some value to people. In that little book over there, that's my little book. It's called Serial Science and Technology.
Wow.
And I did that, I can't even remember when. But when I decided I would do it, I phoned some publishers.
Yes, sir.
And they came to see me in Edinburgh. And they said, oh, you can't do a book without Americans or Australian writers in it. And I told them to go away. And they did. And I got Aberdeen University Press to do it. I didn't even know where Aberdeen was. The guy from Aberdeen came. And we had a chat. The next thing that was done. And the reason why I mention it is, in terms of what we were saying, this book is called Serial Science and Technology. And the irony is, it's the only book now that can have that name. So there are loads of books which says History of Serial Science and Technology. This of science, they cannot use Serial Science and Technology. And in it, the strap line says, technology is science that works. Technology is science that works. Therefore, I really believe that everything we do in life is science-based. When your car doesn't start, the science is wrong. When your equipment here doesn't work, the science is wrong. When, in fact, a tree gets infected, the science is wrong. When an animal dies prematurely, the science is wrong.
Yes, sir.
And therefore, in fact, when you approach anything, whether you are doing history or whether it's science, it's, science itself, if the science isn't right, the technology doesn't work. And therefore, to me, what we do, and when we do it well, and when we do it effectively, then, in fact, the science is right. And therefore, to The science is about the information you have that is right, because that will produce the results you want, or will produce results that will tell you what the reality of the situation is.
Sir.
The reality of the situation. And that's the approach I've used, whether it's in history, you've got to have valid evidence. And whether in science, you've got to have valid evidence. And as far as when I advise people, if you read anything, read the methodology first. First, read the methodology. And if the methodology is faulty, don't read anymore. Pointless. Pointless. The methodology tells you what the person did, how they did it, and you can tell from that the validity of their conclusion. Dodgy methodology, dodgy conclusion. Simple as that. And therefore, to me, that's the advice I would give.
Yes, sir.
To people who want to help our society. Make sure you're ready, and make sure you research, and make sure the information you have is correct as possible, and then, in fact, use that to defend the situation.
Yes, sir.
You cannot defend it with emotional by just saying that is wrong, so you should change it, because a lot of people will say, so why do you think it's wrong? What evidence have you got for it being wrong? So if you're going to defend people, you've got to be ready.
Yes, sir.
And your weapon is evidence, valid evidence.
Absolutely. And moving on to the last question from myself. Speaking about books and subject of books, one of the questions that we like to ask our guests on the show is this. If your life story was a book, given your experiences and dreams and values, what would its title be?
Well, we were just talking about that, so that's very appropriate. I would probably have what I would put. Education works. That's what I'd like the title to be.
Education works.
Works, that's right.
Thank you, Sir Geoff. It's been such an honor. We'll open up to questions now from the guy from Odi, Henry, or Blessing, if anyone has any questions.
So, Sir Geoff, with my question, I would love to go back to the time when you were in the institute, you were working in the institute. And it was really inspiring to hear, the goal you put forth for yourself and how you fought for your research, for the findings you made. And I would love to maybe hear a further reflection on all those processes, because you were able to put yourself on the line in that sense, in order to push for something innovative that could be wrong, right? And thinking about it, I feel like you could also have gone the other way and just, go through the process where you don't have to put yourself on the line, to just do the usual everyday business.
Absolutely.
And not, not take the risk. So I would love to hear you reflect or talk more about that, and maybe give some advice to young people who are, minorities in the workplace, who are, Africans or Black people working in organizations. What advice would you give now in taking risks, right? In putting ourselves on the line? What would you say?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because that's exactly what my boss had said, that when he came round and realized that I had this idea, he said, what you should do or should be doing is this. And he wrote down, and what he wanted me to do was just to analyze routinely a whole bunch of samples. So they were getting in samples every year from all over Europe. And he just wanted me to analyze for this chemical. So all it would mean is grinding up the grain, putting it in a machine, reading the results, writing down a number. And I would be doing that all day, every day. That's all. And he said that was the alternative he gave me. And I decided I wasn't going to have that. I said to him, no, I've got this idea and I think it will work. And I've got valid evidence for it from my PhD. And therefore, this is what I want to pursue. And of course, it would have been easier because if you've got a family and all you're doing is that, analyzing, then it's safe. Your job is safe. No risks, no arguments. You know, there were advantages to it. You are taking no risks. And I think it's something now, maybe in certain jobs, you don't have that choice. You'd have to do what he says. But if you're in a situation like I was, where I didn't have to do that in a sense, but I had to take the risk. And I think that if you're working anywhere and you're in that situation where you could, because it could be deliberate. You're just being given something that you will never get into senior management if you continue to do that. Then you have to speak to your boss or speak to the people around you or whomever, or even go to your boss's boss to actually say, you know, what I've been asked to do is not valid, or it is almost designed to ensure I make no progress, and that what I'm doing is below my capacity. You know, in a way, if you can convey that to the powers that be. Now, there is a danger there, and I'll give you now an example. So an actual example. Edinburgh and the Lothians, they contacted me some time ago, a few years ago. And the name of the person is Mrs. Suleiman. And on her Google website, you can pick her up because she actually comments on this work. So Edinburgh and the Lothians, NHS, no less than the NHS, contacted me to say they did not have a significant representation of Black and ethnic minority people in management. And they don't know what is wrong, why this is the case. So I spoke to Mrs. Suleiman, who's the contact. She's still the diversity person at this sector of the NHS. And we discussed it. And I said, part of the issue you're discussing is about system consciousness, because the failure is occurring at the interview. These people are qualified, doing their job at the highest level, but they are not seen as management material. They always fail at the interview sector. Now, why is that? And I was saying that what you need to do is to set up a course where we're dealing with one aspect of it must be awareness of system consciousness. And these are two words which I have in my little book, The Enlightenment Abolished. There's a copy of it there, the red one. No, it's behind you. If you look, Little River, that one, the fingers on it, yeah. That's my book called The Enlightenment Abolished. It's something I just kept writing when I felt like it. I haven't done it for 2 years. No, it's the other one. Is that the same one? Yes. Oh yeah, that's it. There are two there. Yeah, so I've done that over a little while, and I just call it The Enlightenment Abolished, Citizens of Britishness, and I just kept adding things to it, which happened. So it's got some of my life story in it, and it's got some of what I'm going to say. But there's a little sector in there where I referred to this just two words, system consciousness. And I said to the NHS, that should be in the training. And what I mean by that is understanding the expectations of the system. And the system has got to understand your expectations of the system. Both. And so we set up a course. And within 3 years, we went from 4 managers to 25, or within that sort of figure. So we went up by, by about 20. So why is that? Why is it taken all this time? Because the people who were going for the interview did not understand what they're being interviewed for. They didn't understand the attitude they should adopt for that interview. And what it is judged at that BAME people do not understand, they can't manage. So it's like them being inferior again. They cannot manage. And when you speak to them, they show that they can't manage. And what I'm saying is that has nothing to do with their potential to manage, because they are not aware what the expectation of the management are. And in the same in Nigeria, somebody who wasn't born in Nigeria, even though they're Nigerians, would have difficulty understanding the expectations of what is the Nigerian management system demands of you. So it is cultural ignorance. It is not ability. And I'll give you now an example of a young man a black guy who was very good nurse, very good at his job, but he wasn't progressing. Did bad at the interviews, etc. So I sat him down and I said, look, and the other way around is that the management, if you go with an accent, and certain people have accents from certain cultures, and certain accents are perceived as aggressive when somebody's speaking English from their language. No, that is perceived as not management material. Because if you've got an aggressive accent, how are you going to manage people? They'll be confronting you or afraid of you. But then that's just an accent. It's not your attitude. So again, there's a prejudice from the board. But in terms of the young man who was responding, they regard him as not being appropriately dressed for the interviews, or his attitude to dress was not appropriate. And they couldn't convince him that as a nurse he had to dress in that form, or if he's going for an interview, he should then look more appropriate at that interview, whatever the appropriate means. And he said to me, well, why should I? I said, I'm a good nurse. I'm doing the job. What has got to do with how you dress got to do with the work you do? And the only way I could convince him was, I said, okay, you're on a plane and you're all waiting for the pilot. And a guy comes on in slippers, shorts, T-shirt, says, I hate flying, and smoking a fag and having a wee drink. And the door is open, and you then ask, who's the pilot? And they say him. If you have a choice of getting on and off the plane, what would you do? With your little young son or daughter, what would you do? You say, I get off. I said, that's all they're saying. You expect the pilot to look a certain way. You're not judging his capacity as a pilot. But within the system, those are expectations. You expect the pilot to look what you think is a pilot. Now, the pilot might say, I'm the best pilot in the world. The fact that I have a fag and a thing and wearing slippers and a shorts has nothing to do with it. And therefore, I could then convince him with that analogy, which nobody would put to him because they, either one, didn't understand what that was. And thus, he was in a difficult position because of the way people around him act. So therefore, in terms of trying to help people to understand the system, to progress, within the system, what I think the person has to understand is what is expected. And if they don't understand that, then you're going to get failure. And I think that is an important part. And in trying to motivate people and to try to get them ready or be prepared for those, what I call interviews, then one could set up courses which deal with all aspects of that expectation. And when we got that right, as I said, the strategy is still being used in different ways. But we managed to get 20 people into senior management, which it seemed impossible to achieve. So it's nothing to do with ability. It's to do with making people aware of the culture they're in and what is expected of them. Does that help?
Yes. All right. Thank you very much, sir. It's been very insightful, and I've learned so much, and I'm in awe as well. So, what I was thinking about when you were speaking was that you are a man that has been privileged to live through different generations and different timelines of this history that we have now. And so for you, given that you have lived these different timelines and phases of this whole debate for equality and access to opportunities and wider representation, how does all of this feel for you now, seeing events unfolding? I would like to say there has been a level of progress. Maybe you could speak to how slow you think that progress
Okay.
has been, or how rapid that progress has been. But just looking back and going through all these different timelines, how does that feel for you?
It's interesting. You're right. If I sit back and I can look at 10 years ago, because I retired in 2005. So 10 years is still within my retirement. People have to say to me, could I contact your PA? And I said, my PA is me. I've got a paper diary somewhere in the house, and I've got to look at it every day to figure out what I'm doing. But you're right, 10 years I'd retired. 10 years before that, I was at work in 2005. I was then traveling around the world still until I retired just then. So the world, there were things going on in Nigeria or Kenya or Japan. I spent a short time in Japan. And that was like a different 10 years, because I was going to different countries within that 10 years. And the 10 years before that, I was involved in the research, where I was really trying to hold down my job by trying to be a great achiever. Because if they sacked me, people would want to know why. If I didn't achieve anything, then they could sack me and nobody would notice. And at one place I work, I won't say where, my boss called me up one day and he said, look, Geoff, the world is against you. This was scientific. He said, the world's against you, these concepts you have. And why don't you just issue a rejection of everything you've said? And I said to him, do you know something? And he said, what? I said, at one time, everybody thought the world was flat. It looks flat, but it isn't. And therefore, as far as my work is concerned, it's round and they think it's flat. So why should I change anything? I refused. Again, this was looking back. I think, well, couldn't have that today. You know what I mean? But probably you could. This is the point, that is somebody telling you the world is flat, and you've got to accept it because of your position, or you don't have the capacity to challenge it. There was another situation where, somebody, another situation I was in where I was at work, somebody handed me a sheet of paper one morning. I went into work and they were saying, why don't you leave the job? And I said, I hope you got a copy of that. And he didn't. And, and we sorted it out. But I was always in a position to challenge all of that in any era because of I was successful and the people out there knew it. So if they were going to carry through any of that, then that was a risk for them. And the sad thing is, I was using what I'd achieved, not my rights, legal rights. I was using what I'd achieved as the threat. I didn't know how it was going to work out. So what I had to do in life, as I said before, is to achieve certain things that somebody who was going to threaten me would have to have a very good case because they'd have to justify it. And even with my history stuff, and this is another era where a great professional historian said he was going to sue me. And then he was asked by the Times recently, are you still going to sue him? And he said, no. Almost it's a waste of time because basically I don't have anything. I told my family if they sue me, that's it, you get nothing. The point is that he then said he wasn't going to sue me, and this is only months or so ago. He's not going to sue me because he didn't want to turn a villain into a victim. He actually said that in the Times. The point is that I take no notice of that because his problem is that he cannot invalidate anything I say. That is the point. So I'm using the information I have, the information I've put out. That's my weapon. And it's rather sad that, we are in a position where, and I'm saying this probably cogently for the first time, that what I'm saying throughout my life, through all the decades, is that I somehow learned a long time ago, probably from my aunts, that people who threaten you, they are doing it because they think you're not in a position to defend yourself. So it's cowardly. And therefore, if you then put yourself in a position to defend yourself, it's the best thing you can do in any decade of your life or any situation. And people, as I said, who will try and threaten you or you feel concerned about, is that they think aspects of what you are vulnerable. And it's cowardly. They think they can damage you with no consequences. And thus, each time, when I arrived in the country, for example, if you talk about the 50s, now what am I afraid of? I wasn't afraid of racism or stuff because I didn't know what it was. And people writing KBW, Keep Britain White, on the wall didn't bother me because I just thought I was more bothered about the men standing and stopping my mother and me getting to our house, which was up the road. We had to walk around the block. Now, that would terrify people today. It didn't terrify me, because my attitude was, okay, I'll walk around the block, they're not going to kill me. So I had a different sense of defense through all those eras. And one of the defense I used during the early days was little boys who used to stop me. And they used to say, Mister, what time is it? And they always did it when I was going home up this particular street, because you see, they were told, you're talking about 1957, they were told that black people can't read the time. They you know, they don't understand time and stuff. So they were now making fun, and I was aware of that. So they used to come up to me and say, what time is it, mister? No, they expected me to look at the sun, because that's what they've been told. That black people, they look at the sun to tell the time. So I would look up to the sun, and they say, come on then, what time? And I say 3:15. Of course, they look at their watches, and it was exactly 3:15. And they kept doing it, for ages. Every time I come by, and they'd say, what time is it? And I'd say, 4:45. They'd look at their watch. How'd you do that? What they didn't know, there was a clock on the spar. I was looking at the spar. So there was a whole load of young children who came to adults who think black people can tell the time by the sun. And me taking to it accurately. And therefore, to me, in life, you have to then adopt certain attitudes or certain approaches to deal with prejudice and racism. It's, as you know, I used to say to my children, you can't go around with your fist up, ready for a fight. The fact is that you should be able to defend yourself without having to put your fist up. Or put your fist up when you're ready. However, quite recently in a car park, so that happened in 1957. A month ago in a car park, a chap confronted me about, parking and stuff, and he's going to call the police. And I said, well, do that if you want. And I said I would welcome it. And then he said, what's your phone number? And I said, I'll do better than that. I'll tell you my name. And I gave him, I said, my name is Geoff Palmer. And I live in the village, yeah. And then he Googled me. And then he said, oh, that's okay. And he drove off. He drove off. And that's just recently. But the good end of that story is we met again recently. And he said, you'll not believe it. He said, I'm a Bob Marley fan. That's right. He actually said that. And we discussed Bob Marley. And when I told him that Bob Marley was half white, he said, I never knew that. And therefore, we then shared Bob Marley because he didn't know. And I said, well, and he was saying, and, I have a problem with my health. And I said, well, what is it? I said, I've got health problems too. And he said, it's my cholesterol, And I said, oh, cholesterol. Oh, you should eat porridge. I said, because it's good for cholesterol. Because, see, I've done research on the gum in oats that can reduce cholesterol. So when you read a Kellogg's box and it says good for cholesterol, it's the oats contains a gum. And I've done research. My student from Nigeria, he's done work on that gum. It's in that thesis. And therefore we were helping each other. I was helping him with the gum in cereals, and he was talking to me about Bob Marley, and we were talking about Bob Marley's heritage. And we perfectly, from amicable closeness as a human being, which started off with a confrontation in a car park. And again, there is every possibility that he saw me as reflecting somebody who he could speak to in that way. He felt I had no status, no position, but it shouldn't be that, because he was speaking to my mother. He should treat her the same way as anybody else. And therefore, people are still suffering from that prejudice. And no matter what decade it is, and even in the next 10 decades to come, our system must understand that. I spoke to some school kids a month ago in the city chambers. And when I spoke to those children, the teachers put on Twitter or contacted me by email and said, the children said they want you to speak to them because you back up what you say. That's what the children told their teachers. I back up what I say. And what I said to them, one of the things I said, the way I put it, was we were meeting in the city chambers. And all the kids were there from different schools. And I used the David Hume story. I said, when you're coming here this morning, you pass a big statue on the high street near the courts. And I said, people were rubbing his toes and stuff. I said, that's David Hume. And he said that Negroes were inferior to whites. And I said, you see the building we're in? I said, look up and look at the magnificence of it. It's city chambers. I said, he said that in 1753. This building was built in 1753. He said it because the merchants who built this building were involved in the mistreatment of black people. And therefore, he was giving them an excuse to mistreat the black people to get the money to build this building. And the children understood that. This nonsense that you can't tell children this history because it'll upset them. We did a survey from the Council's project, Edinburgh Council's project, where we produced 10 recommendations. And we surveyed the public, and the response from the young people were the most positive, saying this history should be in the curriculum and you shouldn't take statues down, from young people. And therefore, it is nonsense that you cannot tell people this history. Scottish people have said to me, why hasn't anybody told us all this before? And therefore, to change the attitudes of people over every now generation, every 10 years or whatever, we have to develop a strategy of informing them of this past. Because when people are reacting, you know, some of the police are reacting in a way because there's a myth there that they think black people are black men. You got to go in heavier because they are stronger and more aggressive and more difficult. So therefore, You have that. If you don't understand that, you don't understand that's against you. So you react in a way that might just precipitate. Because that's the prejudgment. If you don't understand prejudgment. And just like the guy in the car park, he obviously thinks that I'm going to be afraid when he says he's going to call the police. Because I'm not. Because I haven't done anything. So therefore, people are using things which they think from their prejudgment is going to frighten you. You see what I mean? So these are pronouncements, and any decent policeman understands that that's not true. Anyway, and thus we have to get that voice across, that these people who think that are prejudging. They are acting to prejudices which they've heard. And thus, you know, the more information we can put out there is the better for everybody. Because if somebody's going to prejudge that, you know, you need firm action, to prejudge that if somebody tells you about the police, you're going to give up your rights. You see what I mean? Then this hasn't changed over many generations. Mrs. Lawrence is still writing yesterday. It's coming up to the Stephen Lawrence's, I think it's about this time, Stephen Lawrence's anniversary. And Mrs. Lawrence was saying things haven't changed in terms of the attitudes towards black people. And that is very sad. But the work we're doing, the work you're doing, is trying to put it out there to say, yes, over the decades have gone, things have gotten a bit better, but then there is still this attitude, which was there in slavery, that black people are unreliable, shiftless, dangerous, and in fact can be treated badly because basically that's how nature made them. And believe it or not, that is still there, out there, and we've got to try and change that. And what people have said to me, we can't confront it because of our jobs or our position or whatever. And I think that's very sad, whether people are black or white. If they see something or hear something like that which is not true and which is damaging in some ways, whether it's in the press or otherwise, then what I'm saying to people, some people may not be able to do it, but if you can, do. And some of us, we may have to stick our necks on the block. But nevertheless, that is the issue. That people know that something is wrong, but feel they can do nothing because it is against their interest. So things will improve, but it's got to come through education, but it's also got to come to, as again, I keep quoting Burns because I know a bit about what he's written. And if you look in my hallway out there, there's a big plaque made from lead. Somebody from Glasgow gave it to me from a pub, the Oranmore, and it's out there in the hall, and it says, goodness mitigates woe, and iniquity is wrong. It's out there on my wall. So the goodness to try and confront wrongs and trying to put them right has lasted me from I arrive until now. I can see it. The point is that if you ask me what needs to be done, it's for good people to see a wrong and try to put it right. That's what we need. And it's been there since 1955 to now. But the good people that I've met have helped me. And without their help, I wouldn't be sitting here today. And they're not just the two I mentioned. There's also the professor at London University. He took me for my job in 1958. And my name isn't Geoff. My name is Godfrey. My mom never called me Geoff. She kept saying, "Who's Geoff? Who's this Geoff?" And so when I get official documents, that's Geoff written there and whatever, this is Geoff in my book. But if I pick up an official document from that table, it's Godfrey. So when I get funds from the government, the tax, or anybody, it's Godfrey Palmer. And my name became Geoff in 1958 when I went for the interview at London University, Queen Elizabeth's College in Kensington. And I was sitting in a room like this, and Professor Chapman walked in, and Professor Chapman said, "Are you the young man for the interview, for the job?" I was there for a job as a junior laboratory technician. It was when I left school in London in 1958. And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm the young man for the job." He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Godfrey Henry Oliver Palmer, sir." And he said, "Godfrey Henry Oliver Palmer." He said, "Can I call you Geoff?" And I said, "Okay." I said, "If I get the job." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay." And ever since then, for no good reason, I just kept calling myself Geoff. And no other reason for it. So when some people have said to me, "Why did you let a white person call you Geoff and you picked it up and use it?" I said it was no big deal. And I thought, Geoff, yeah, that's okay. Godfrey, in where I lived in Highbury, sounded posh. So I thought Geoff was appropriate for where I live. And ever since then, I've been calling myself Geoff. The irony of that is, if you're confronting the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. I went there in 1958. Kensington is next to Notting Hill Gate. And I had to get off the train at Notting Hill Gate in 1958, and there were riots. Black people were being chased down and up the road in 1958. It was the time of the riots, attack on black people. No, I still didn't see that as racist. It's just some bad guys chasing me. But I got off that train on my own to go to work. And I had to be careful because I had to keep looking. If a white guy looked suspicious, then I would walk away. So it was being system conscious at the time. So I got off the train at Notting Hill Gate, the tube, and I walked up to my work 5 days a week. And I was helping my mother because we were at times being evicted from our property, despite we're paying half the 50% of money we earned. Sometimes was going into rent. And the landlord gave us notice to quit, and I had to go to court because my mom was praying, and I said, "Praying at work." We got to also be able to know the law. So I went to the library and I was checking the law of renting. And in those days, if you were part furnished, you're okay. They had some chairs and stuff. But if you were fully furnished, you're in trouble. Like a landlord could put you out. So I had to understand all that to go to court to defend my mother because the landlord turned off the water. In my garage, I can show you the bucket before you leave. I used that bucket to collect water from the neighbors for my mother in 1959-60. A bucket, metal bucket. I had got it and I was walking up over the road begging water because the landlord turned our water off, trying to force us out. But that made me late for work sometimes and whatever. And Professor Chapman noticed that because, I was coming in, running, doing things and phoning my mother and checking on things like that. And one day in 1958, 59, he stopped me, 59, and he said, I want you out this building to go to university by 1961. That's when I went to Leicester University. And he insisted, and he gave me a time off, half day off when I needed it to go to the local polytechnic. And that's how I got my qualifications for university, because I didn't get them at the grammar school. And when I applied to every university I could in 1961, they all rejected me because I wasn't an overseas student. I was a local black student from London, which they weren't used to. So when I said I lived in Bride Street, they just probably put it in a bucket. And just before the university time in October 1961, Chapman came into the lab and he said, which university are you going to? And I said, none, sir. And he said, you mean none? What do you mean by that? I said, well, I applied, but none of them wanted me. I got all the A-levels required. And he said, go to my room and stand at the door. And I stood at the door on a Friday afternoon. And he came out in about 20 minutes, and he said, you're going to Leicester University, good luck. He had telephoned and got me into Leicester with a telephone call. That's how I got into Leicester University. So when I arrived, I'd not even completed an application form. So I arrived at Leicester in 1961 because Professor Chapman made a phone call. So again, he's a person without whom I wouldn't be here. And some people would say, why did you attack him for saying he's going to call you Geoff? He didn't tell me I had to call myself Geoff. I decided on that. So don't fight the wrong battles. Don't fight the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And I had a confrontation with him. Why would he phone and get me into Leicester? He got me into Leicester because he understood I was helping my mum with all the court cases. So he was aware of my difficulties without me saying a word. And that's the importance of your relationship with people, to understand difficulties without them having to tell you. And and the good story of that is I went to Leicester in 1961. I graduated in 64. The end of last year, I had a letter from Leicester University. And the principal wrote, and they said, we have some good news for you. I think I got a bit of a cough. They said, we have some good news for you. I said, what is it? And they said, well, we're going to tell you that we want you to bring your family to Leicester. You know, we've got an event. And I said, well, what's the event? And they sort of vaguely, said it. But they had contacted me before to tell me I was selected as one of the university's best 100 graduates in 100 years. That's one of the things they said. I was one of Leicester University's best graduates in 100 years. It's their 100-year celebration last year. And that they did a drawing of me, and they also did a narrative of me, and that was okay. But this, when we arrived at Leicester, now to tell the story, so I took my family down to Leicester, and they took me round to a building, and there it was. It's called Sir Geoff Palmer's accommodation. It's a building the size of this road. Did you not know that?
I think you mentioned that the Black Professional Scotland event last year.
Yeah, but I didn't go into detail. But this is what it is, and it's on my phone. I'll show you. If you just type, it's on my phone. Where I arrived at Leicester, A university I arrived at in 1961 on a phone call. In 2022, the university had named an enormous building Sir Geoff Palmer accommodation. And it was wonderful standing there and looking at students of all colours walking in and out that building. And they were walking past me, they know the hell it was. But I thought that was even better because I was standing there and students of all races and all colours and creeds and whatever, standing there. And because of Chapman making a phone call, got me there. So again, we can change all that. If you can't do it yourself, we need good people who will see a wrong and put it right. And that's why I say what I say, and I say it in detail, because you can edit. The point is that that's how our world has got to work, because you can't do it yourself, and your children can't. The other day I sat out there and I saw a little girl run across the road, and I couldn't get up my car quick enough, and her grandmother had walked out the door and thought the little girl was standing with her mother, but she wasn't. And she just took off across the road. Had a car come there. It would be murder. And I kept tooting my horn, just in case if a car was coming, they would hear a horn at least. Because I was strapped in and I couldn't get out. So good people who will do something for you, even though you're not there, is critical in the way we live. Critical in the way we live. So that's another person. And that's the end result of that. You know, so that's my thing at Leicester. And of course, that's where I met my wife in 1961. And it's because I completely screwed up her bicycle. Because I said, well, I'm a botanist. Why do you get a botanist to fix a bicycle? You want an engineer? But we had no engineers in Haringey. But anyway, I hope that, answers it. I give these long answers, basically, you can pick out what you want. Because I think that people who sometimes, when they respond to things, they give a truncated story, and you can't really, the public listening, if you pick out the right bits, they can get a better feel of what I'm getting at. I could just sit here and say, yeah, I'm a very clever bloke and I did that and get those exams and I did that and I got to Leicester and I got this honours degree and I went to Edinburgh and got a PhD, and I went, it wasn't like that at all. And it won't be like that for us for a long time. And it's not even like that for white people, much less for us. Because if certain people don't do certain things within the society, you would never, ever get to where. And if people are against you, you are in some trouble if you have no perception of it. So that is something I want to get across to people. You're not a self-made man or woman. Okay, so I'll let you do your question.
Okay. So can you hear this?
Yep, this. Yep, this one is good. Yes, you have to try.
Okay. So thank you, Sir Geoff, for it's been very inspiring listening to you and your story so far. But I think most of the questions I wanted to ask, you've already touched on in your answer to Odinaka. But I would want to find out, like, what are you looking forward to? Like, I know you've still been very busy, even after retirement, with a lot of projects. But, like, is there a particular feat or project that you would want to achieve? And
Good question, because at 83, people would be looking at you and says you should be in an old people's home, because that's what I used to be on the board of an organization that looks after, older people. And thus, a lot of them are a lot younger than 83. I think you went in there at 65. So at 83, you would be there. And I've been very lucky. I've got little health issues, but so has other people. But in terms of what I'd like to achieve further, in terms of, I'd like the grandchildren to do well. And one of my grandchildren, it's lucky I lived this long, grandchildren is now at Glasgow University. He's entered and he's doing okay, I'm told. So again, that to me is an achievement, that I've got a grandchild at the university, which I never thought I'd live long enough to see. And the others are doing fairly well, so they should get there. I've got a grandson who's a very good footballer. He's in some Chelsea young boys team, so he plays well. I don't know if he doesn't play cricket, which I play. In fact, cricket got me to the grammar school, so I didn't pass an exam. The headmaster wanted a cricketer. That's what he told me. And I was good at cricket, so he had me transferred. But no, I think wanting the kids to do well, but also hoping that we can get this history as a standard feature of the curriculum. I see our history as important as mathematics, physics, chemistry, and it should be there. Warts and all. I don't want it truncated or manipulated, where people I think that the horrors of that history, some people say we can't teach that. The point is, yes, we can, because it also tells people that if you do things which are unacceptable, they will be remembered. And they will be, your family and the people that come after you will have to bear that responsibility. And I think that's what I would want. Because we live in a world where people think there are no consequences to their actions. So I hope, other than saying my family doing, the grandchildren doing okay in life as best they can, is to see that the work we've done on trying to educate the public about this enormous event that happened in the world. I don't think anything else, I may be exaggerating, happened in the world as significant as this. I call it the most profitable evil the world has known. And therefore, this is just beginning to dawn on the world. Believe it or not. The world is just beginning to, in awe, to realize that over 30 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic for no other reason than to enslave them to work for nothing, under some myth that it was justified on the basis of inferiority. And if anything I achieve, if I've achieved anything now or in the future, if I could be part of that, where people worldwide begin to understand and accept that was wrong and cannot be justified, and that they must ensure that, and the way I speak it is that the person who could have probably cured cancer died in a sugar plantation because his descendant who could have done it are not here. The person who could have cured cancer today, his ancestor, probably died in a sugarcane plantation. So that person male or female, they're not here for that. And to me, when we destroy a human being, we're destroying that, because nobody knows at birth our potential. Nobody knows the potential of anybody at birth. And therefore, the potential of 30 million people, their descendants. That's how I look at it. It's probably never been said like that. The descendants. And you could say it about other people in other parts of the world, but same thing applies. But I'm saying it could apply there too. And that's what we have lost. And therefore, it is not about the sugar and the cotton and the coffee they produced. It's about the people they could have produced. And that cannot be addressed in terms of reparation, giving money back. People are now talking about that. And I'm a little concerned where people think you can pay for that. You can't pay for that. Okay, people can talk about, reparation in terms of scholarships, education. In Glasgow, they've changed the name of the building, or they put the new name up. Is it McCune Smith? James McCune Smith building. Yeah. And therefore you've got the James McCune Smith building, and that's named after a black Glasgow student, medical student, I think, first medical student, and that's up on the building. That's a form of reparation. And I'm pleased to see that. I'm pleased to know about the scholarship. I'm pleased to know that people are trying to do reparation. People are talking about money, but all that is fine. But what I'd like people to do, they don't have to give a thing. They just have to treat people better today in terms of education and opportunities and representation. That's what I would like reparation in that, to ensure that obstacles which are not relevant or valid or etc. should be removed, or people should be enlightened of them so they can deal with them themselves. And hopefully that we can produce the work and that we can have the children, and one of them will have the capacity to say, that's what's wrong. That's the cure for cancer. Or any other. Look at the fact we had that virus, COVID-19. It tells us we need every brain, because the brains we had here weren't capable. The brains we had in the world were not capable of doing very much for 2 years. And it has left a lot of legacies. When you think that we, with our educational capacity in science, that we were walking around wringing our hands because a lot of people didn't know what to do. Didn't know what to do. Therefore, we need every brain. We need to educate every brain in the hope that we're going to produce the individuals who will help us. Because if we've got COVID and can't do anything about it, our problem is our educational potential. Going to the moon is easy. It's mechanical. We can set a rocket and get there. But we couldn't handle COVID. See, because it's innovative thinking, it's new thinking. And we need people. So for the future, I just hope we can ensure that we educate as many people as possible, so that our time here, whether it's we can deal with climate change or we can deal with any new dangers like that, and that if what I'm saying and what I'm doing motivate people to do better, then I hope. I probably can't do anything myself in terms of the science and the technology and the whatever. But I'm thinking of what I've been through and what I've seen. And I look at things like COVID or climate, and I say we need new brains to try and solve those problems. Mobile phones and apps and stuff we can do, but what we're doing is developing the technology. Nobody is gonna come up tomorrow with a new concept like the mobile phone. The new concept like, the capacity to go to the moon. What I'm saying, we need those, and COVID requires those. If another virus comes, which is worse than COVID, then we're in trouble again, so to speak. And the first thing they're going to tell us to wear a mask. We should be able to say, we've got a new virus and we can deal with it in a week because we know what to do. That's what I hope for the future, that we will have the capacity to deal with anything that will affect humanity. And that's what I hope for the future. And we need to educate everybody because we don't know the capacity of any human brain at birth.
Absolutely. And on a lighter note, sir, how do we get to look this good at 83?
Good at 83. Well, I don't know how good I look. I think what it is it's my mother's genes. I think that's what it is. I think when she was, ill and before she passed away, we used to have discussion with her, and that lady was lying there. She never had a wrinkle in her face at 86. So it must be genetics. So I owe everything to her, even the way I look at 83. It's her doing. And as far as she said, and I've mentioned it before, when she her views of me, and you've got a photo of her there, and when anybody asked her about me, and she lived in Haringey, and when you've heard of Bernie Grant, he's a black politician who did a lot for black people in Tottenham. He was one of the first black MPs, and but he was a student in Edinburgh. A lot of people don't know that. So black activists, or real black activists, they know all have heard of Bernie, but he was a student in Edinburgh, and I met him and we discussed it, and he went down to London. Again, it's pure chance. We met in a restaurant in Edinburgh, but he was at the Heriot Ward. So when I say that to activists in London, they say, Bernie Grant in Scotland. No sort of relationship. If you said he was from Manchester or Birmingham, perfect. But he was a student in Scotland at the Heriot Ward. And I sent him to London, and he went and he met my mum because he went down to Haringey and he became MP of Haringey. And was having the riots with the police and stuff, the Tottenham riots, which changed the whole attitude. Relationship improved it, in fact. And so my mother knows people like him. And of course, when her neighbour, when she came to Scotland to see me when I got a Doctor of Science degree, and she went back, and I went with her, and I'm up at the window listening to her talking to her neighbour. In fact, her neighbour was Mrs. Penicuik. But it's spelled a different way. It's Pennycook. And I'm living in Penicuik. But it's Penicuik, Penicuik. So the same name. And both names apply. So the fact that I'm here is strange. So my mom is talking to Mrs. Penicuik. And Mrs. Penicuik is saying to her, Miss Ivy, because that's how these Jamaicans speak, Miss Ivy, what's your son doing in Scotland? And my mother would say, oh, my son, oh, he's at school. I was professor there. You know, I was maybe senior lecturer in '85. Yeah, he's at school, and then even later, I was still at school when I was professor, and then she said, "Well, what's his purpose in life, Miss Ivy? You know, your son doing all this thing in Scotland." She said, "Well, he's just God's vehicle. He's just doing what God tells him to do. So I've never achieved anything. I'm on instructions." But she was a woman who went to the Greek Orthodox Church up the road. And when the Greeks used to come down and say to me, "Who is this woman? Is she your relation?" And I said, "Well, what's the matter?" And they said, "Well, she comes to our church. That's the Greek Orthodox Church. My mother doesn't speak Greek." She's in the church. And when I said to my mother, "Why do you go to the church?" She says, "It's closer than the other one." the fact that it was a Greek church meant nothing to her. And that's what is the closeness that mattered. So that's my background. I come from a mother like that and my aunts. So I don't have this, you know, anything to defend what I call cultural elitism. But what they had was resilience. That my mom she went to her work, she worked in the East End of London, and she worked as a dress finisher. And she worked and worked until she got ill. Never took a day off, never took a holiday. She worked what they call holiday pay. That meant you don't take your holiday, you go to work and got paid. And they regarded that as a tremendous privilege. Not taking a holiday, working your holidays and getting paid. That's what real Windrush is about. And that's the resilience which I hope I've inherited, the responsibility. And that, in fact, gives me the so-called drive and the fact that, you know, I'm not bothered, from the man in the car park to the people who run the country. They don't make any difference to me. The fact is, as long as I'm thinking, doing the best I can, they don't bother me. So, you know, so as far as for the future, I just hope every race, and I don't believe in the word race, that every person in our community, I will put it that way, that every person in our community is given the education. That's what we say, what's my final hope? That everybody is educated to the best of their abilities. And that we educate everybody because we need every brain to provide us with the protection we need when we're confronted with problems like COVID. That we have to be ready for that. And therefore we've got to educate everybody, because we do not know the capacity of any human being at birth. Not one. And thus every brain that we can educate to ensure that our humanity progresses and not suffer in any way, we need to educate. We can't exclude one person. So racism is out. Classism is out. Gender prejudice is out. All those prejudice against anybody, a human being, is out. And we've got to get that, we've got to get used to that. We can't make anybody. You know, you and I have been in the making since this world began. That's the importance of your life. We've been in the making from the world began. And when somebody murders you or takes your life away, they're behaving like God, because they're stopping something that has been going on from the world began. And thus, destroying the lives of the enslaved was wrong. They had no right to even think of it. You cannot make up any excuses for that. We need the money, or they're not human, or they're inferior humans. It's just nonsense. And thus, that's my hope, that we ensure that every brain is educated to the best of our capacities, because that's what we need.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoff. It's been
Okay.
an honor, and thank you for this podcast.
Okay, thank you very much.
And it's been, thank you very much for your life examples and all you are for having us in your house. We are very grateful for the privilege. Thank you, sir.
And you're most welcome, and I really admire what you're doing, and you are the voice you're getting to the public. And I tell other media people that you don't realize what important what you're going to do is, because you're getting across to the public information which they probably hadn't even thought of, the relationship between things, which I've had 83 years to think about. So thank you very much, and safe trip home.